Chapter 37, New Conflagrations, World War II. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to another video by me, Mr. G, and this time I'll be doing my best to outline the origins of World War II. I'll go into detail to show the keynotes during the war. I'll help you understand life during war-torn countries during this time period, and help explain the post-war situation that ended up setting the stage for the Cold War. So the origins of the bloodiest conflict in human history is complex and pretty varied, but I'll do my best to pinpoint and simplify the roots of the war. To start, the most obvious and irrefutable cause of the Second World War are the legacies left behind from the First. The Entente, despite being victorious, were utterly devastated, and their manpower and economic capabilities had been severely crippled. This, of course, led them to be extremely spiteful of the Central Powers, especially the Germans, who were the leading power within the alliance. The Treaty of Versailles was viewed as a great insult to the Germans, and was extremely severe, imposing heavy reparations. They had been so heavy, in fact, that the German state would take until 2010 to finally be able to repay all the debt they incurred after the loss. In 1923, after the Germans couldn't pay all the reparations, the French marched troops into the Rhineland, the industrial centerpiece of Germany, and occupied it. This wasn't just a grave insult, but also acted as a way to further cripple the recovering German economy by stripping away one of its most vital regions. This aggravated the Germans immensely, and as I'm sure you can imagine. And this wasn't helping in 1929 when the American stock market crashed and the German economy went into freefall. Their economic state was one of the worst recorded in world history, as the price of a loaf of bread costed around 200 billion marks. These economic woes added to the dishonor of losing 27,000 square miles of land, or over 13% of all of its landmass. That's, of course, ignoring their loss of all their imperial possessions, which did in fact strip Germany of all of her colonies. This wasn't just true for Germany, though, as the Kingdom of Italy was also extremely unsatisfied with the ending of World War I, despite being one of the victors. Italy took well over 1 million deaths during the war fighting the Austro-Hungarians, and had fought extremely bravely. Despite this, they were largely ignored during the peace treaties after World War I. This led to resentment towards their former allies, and set the stage for a conflict in the future. In the East, despite Japan's rather limited experience during the war, they wanted to be treated just like the other major European powers who fought in the war. They had felt betrayed and not treated as equals, which also fueled resentment. Japan's former allies also held vital colonial possessions which Japan desperately wanted. The reasons outlined above were some of the more long-term problems that plagued the world before the war. The events more adjacent to World War II that ultimately were the sparks to light the flame of war included the fascist rise to power in Italy and their subsequent invasions of Abyssinia and later their takeover of Albania. The Nazis' rise to power within Germany, which began in 1933 and led to Germany leaving the League of Nations and actively disobeying the Treaty of Versailles. In 1936, they marched troops into the Rhineland, disobeying its demilitarization status. The Anschluss of Germany in 1938, which added the German-speaking nation of Austria into the new German Reich, the Munich Agreement, which saw the Allies granting Germany permission to annex the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, and then them proceeding to break the agreement and march further into the nation, capturing the capital of Prague. In Japan's case, they launched an aggressive war of expansion beginning in 1931 by fabricating the Mukden Incident. They stepped up this aggression in 1937 when the Marco Polo Bridge incident occurred. This was used as a pretext for the Japanese to launch a full-scale invasion of China, and it marked the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Some believe that this was the true beginning of the Second World War. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, some of the greatest war crimes and human rights violations in human history occurred, such as human experimentation at Unit 731, or the brutal torturing of prisoners of war and civilians to gain intel. The worst of these abuses happened during the Rape of Nanjing, which was a period of about 6 weeks where destruction of property, rape, and murder were all commonplace. Most estimates place the death toll at 200,000 dead during the massacre. During the entirety of the Second Sino-Japanese War, modern estimates range between 3 to 14 million dead due to Japanese atrocities. Between 15 to 22 million military deaths occurred on both sides. This wasn't the only tension-raising thing the Japanese did during this time period, as in 1939 they launched an attack against the Soviets in 1938 at Lake Khasan. It ended in failure for the Japanese, and many historians, including myself, believe that That is what made the Japanese army fall out of favor with the imperial government and saw the Japanese strategy of turning south and capturing European colonies. All of this Japanese aggression didn't go unanswered, however, as even the broken and politically fractured Chinese formed a resistance front to fend off the Japanese military advances. The Japanese aggression formed a sense of nationalism within Chinese nationals, and by 1937, the warring Chinese states, most notably the nationalists and communists, united to fight together and defeat the Japanese. Despite not really defeating the Japanese, they did tie down hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers, which counted as nearly half of the entire Japanese army. The ideological differences between the Chinese factions threatened to tear the alliance apart at multiple points throughout the war, up to the point of even coming to clashes. This lack of synergy did make resistance much less effective than it could have been. These buildups in tension were all aided by the Spanish Civil War, which erupted in 1936. This was considered to be a true prelude to World War II, as Italian and German volunteers clashed with Soviet volunteers, and even American ones who were a part of the Lincoln Battalion. The Spanish Civil War helped iron out some of the questions behind modern warfare and taught the German military staff a lot of valuable lessons they would use in the war to come. All of these acts of aggression within Europe had been allowed via the Allies' policy of appeasement. This policy set forth the idea that to bring peace in our time, as Neville Chamberlain put it, you would need to make concessions in order to avoid a war. In practice, however, it allowed Adolf Hitler to centralize power and continue to grow strength and industrial might in Germany. When eventually the Allies put their foot down, the German war machine had grown too strong and it trampled the Allies early in the war. Despite the Allies' best of intentions, appeasement did not function as intended and merely strengthened the German state. The war finally broke out when Hitler betrayed the agreement he made during the Munich conference and invaded Poland. He did this after securing a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This pact also divided Poland after the invasion was successful. The French and British, along with their allies, declared war upon Nazi Germany and began mobilization as the Germans invaded into Poland. The speed and ferocity of the Wehrmacht devastated the Polish resistance, who were fatally unprepared for the conflict. As the Polish state collapsed under the weight of the combined German and Soviet offensives, where allies in the West were all scrambling to prepare their forces, before the armies had even been fully mobilized, the Germans had already dealt with Poland and changed their focus to the West. In a maneuver eerily similar to the Schlieffen Plan of World War I, the Germans launched a massive mobile offensive throughout Belgium to encircle the majority of every French army. Unlike in World War I, though, this was successful, and the French surrendered after only 6 weeks of fighting. A new France was created, and instead, a France that acted as a puppet of the German government. Vichy France would fight alongside the Axis until 1944, where they too would collapse to hostile occupation. This new form of fast, maneuverable warfare was deemed as blitzkrieg by the Germans and remained as a major strategic strategy throughout the war. What may have saved the Allies' resistance efforts occurred at Dunkirk when Allied forces, mostly the British, were rescued by sea to head to Britain. This saved thousands of lives and lots of valuable equipment that would prove pivotal in the later stages of the war. After the fall of France and Germany, more or less securing their position on the continent, they launched an air war across the English Channel and over the United Kingdom. Dogfights and brutal bombings took place regularly in England. 55,000 civilian casualties
fire on Jap tunnel positions at hill number
British
1.
staved off defeat, and Hitler changed his sights to the Balkans. Yugoslavia and Greece stood in his path, but they were both quashed under the German boot. The Germans front even extended to North Africa, where tank commander made a name for himself harassing the British forces.
Destroying Japs entrenched in hillside
the
cave.
German army seemed
Our
unstoppable.
troops used demolition
Hitler
charges composed
was
of
finally ready
25
to begin
pounds
his
of
final plan of
TNT in a bag with a 15-second
and
fuse.
sought the plentiful lands of
Resulting
the Soviet
explosions
Union.
closed all but the biggest cave,
Codenamed Operation
leaving the
Barbarossa.
Japs inside
It was
to
the
starve.
largest land offensive ever launched in human history. And fortunately, it stayed taken by 6 million Axis troops and tens of thousands of tanks and planes prepared.
Patrols
This was meant
attempt
to
to
finally
rescue
ensure
troops of
Axis
E and F
global
companies,
domination.
151st
At
Regiment,
first, the Germans looked
stranded without
unstoppable.
water,
The Russian
food,
army
and
was
ammunition
decimated
on the
at
top of
every
a
turn in the
hillside.
beginning, with hundreds of thousands of
The
soldiers
rescue party
surrendering.
tries
The
to
Luftwaffe
scale the
establishing air
250-foot,
superiority.
90-degree cliff
By the winter of
with the aid of a
1941,
guide rope,
much of the industrial
but
heartland
crumbling
of the
rocks
Soviet
make it
Union was under
impossible
German
for
control.
troops to climb the
The former
hillside.
Russian capital of
When the rope
Leningrad,
is secured to the top
formerly
of the
called
hill,
St. Petersburg,
supplies are
was under
hoisted to
siege.
the stranded men.
These early
Initial
victories would
attempts
soon
to
be
pull up
stopped,
the water
as the
cans
vast
are
expanses of
unsuccessful,
Russia were too
and
large for
additional
effective
men have to
district
be placed
tactics.
on the hillside to
Especially
lend a
since the
hand at
supply
pulling.
lines during the Russian winter were horribly stretched thin, and the cold was so severe that oil froze within vehicles, and thousands froze to death. Still, this didn't faze the German high command, who, although missing their opportunity to capture Moscow, had been able to seize the initiative once again in the spring of 1942, and the objective had changed to the conquest of the Ural Mountains, which now contained the bulk of the Russian manufacturing and most of their oil fields, which the Germans desperately needed. The Soviets at this point had been able to rally to defend their homeland and had turned this into a patriotic war. This made Russian troops desperate for victory, and their resolve unrelenting. On the other side of the world, the United States had been aiding the British through the lending of supplies in their time of need. Through this Lend-Lease policy, the Americans had lent millions of dollars worth of supplies, and after the Japanese occupied French Indochina, they embargoed the Japanese from all American oil and froze their assets within the United States. This economic pressure would not be enough to fend off the Japanese, however, and on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt referred to it as a date that will live in infamy. The Japanese had sent in carriers full of bombers to destroy the American Pacific Fleet, meaning Americans and Allied possessions in the Pacific would be nearly impossible to defend. It obliterated much of the American fleet, and naval power in the region would be weakened for quite some time. On December 11th, 1941, the countries of Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, despite not being bound by treaty to do so. Immediately after the enormous victory at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese swept across the Pacific and conquered the territories of Hong Kong, Thailand, Malaya, as well as the islands of the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and the island of Midway. The Japanese followed these attacks up with the conquering of the Dutch East Indies and various British possessions. These successes made Australia and New Zealand within striking distance. On the other hand, however, the Japanese slogan of Asia for Asians no longer seemed to resonate with non-Japanese Asians, as they had already seen the brutality and savagery of the Japanese forces. Despite the stream of seemingly unending victories, the awakening of the sleeping giant in the United States and the Soviet juggernaut in 1941 marked the beginning of the end for the Axis powers. Even though the Japanese and Germans exploited conquered territories for all they were worth, American and Soviet industry still dwarfed that of the Axis. Even German victories, such as their sinking of around 2,500 merchant ships, were mitigated due to the U.S. producing more trading convoys than the Germans could sink. Back in Europe, the Germans had begun to falter, as in 1943 they suffered their first major defeat at the hands of the Soviets at the Battle of Stalingrad, where 1.1 million Soviets died and about 800,000 Axis died. At Leningrad, the grueling siege had been made into a stalemate, as neither side could change the tide, and it was becoming increasingly clear to the Germans that Moscow was not going to fall. After these setbacks, Hitler ordered counterattacks, which failed spectacularly, and did little but drain more German resources. By 1944, the Germans had been pushed out of Russia and into Eastern Europe. By April 1945, the Soviets were on the cusp of Berlin. The Soviets had finally defeated the Wehrmacht. As the Germans began to fail in the East, the Allies turned the tide in the West. The Germans had been pushed entirely out of North Africa, and the British and Americans launched a naval invasion into Italy, and by August of 1944, the Italians had been knocked out of the war entirely. On June 6, 1944, the D-Day landings on Normandy took place, giving the Allies a foothold in France and opening a third front for the Germans. Before the Soviets captured Berlin, Adolf Hitler shot himself. On the Pacific Front, the turning point really occurred during the Battle of Midway on the 4th of June, 1942. Despite the crippled American force barely being operational after attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. were able to turn the tables using the code-breaking operation they called Magic. After a handful of other important victories, the Americans officially put the Japanese on the defensive. They adopted a strategy of island hopping, where they would capture an island and then hop from that island to the next nearest strategically vital island until they came into close proximity to the Japanese mainland. Some of the most brutal of these island hoppings were at Iwo Jima in Okinawa, where the Japanese put up stiff opposition and fought until death. This made the Americans believe that the Japanese would never surrender and would fight to the end. In July of 1944, the island of Saipan fell to the Americans, and Iwo Jima and Okinawa would fall soon after. The industrial capacity of Japan was being utterly flattened as American bombers devastated Japanese cities, and on August 6th and August 9th, 2 nuclear bombs were dropped on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These would, by the grace of God, be the only nuclear bombs dropped on a hostile target in world history. Soon after these devastating attacks, the Japanese would officially surrender, marking the end of the bloodiest chapter in military history. As bloody as the military death toll is, it would all pale in comparison to the horrors that civilians would have to face under the brutal occupation or bombings of foreign powers. These abuses would never be as prevalent as they were within the German and Japanese occupation areas, where Nazi and imperial authorities would abuse and rape captured civilians and impose strict quotas onto the working people. If the quotas weren't met, you'd either be killed or wish you had been. These horrible conditions gave rise to resistance movements, who proved pivotal in stopping the German war machine by harassing production centers, supply depot, and supply convoys. They also provided intel to Allied forces following D-Day, and waged guerrilla campaigns against Axis forces tying down much-needed troops. Although none of this was as bad as the atrocities mentioned above, and while the wrongdoings of every side were extremely brutal, none would compare to those committed by the Third Reich in Imperial Japan. Millions were killed by execution without trial or by killing squads, as highlighted by the rape in Nanjing mentioned a while ago. But the events where this would all come to a head would be forever remembered as synonymous with brutal atrocities: the Holocaust. In 1942, Hitler enacted his final solution to rid Europe of his, quote, Jewish problem. He did this by loading European Jews into cattle cars and shipping them to camps, where they would either be used as slave labor to produce material for the Reich or gassed and burned. This systematic slaughter had never been seen before, and fortunately never has since. It led to the death of over 6 million Jews and over 11 million undesirables, such as gypsies and gays. The war brought about some of the greatest destruction ever seen before, and finally, in 1945, it was time to settle a peace that would hopefully last. Nearly 60 million men, women, and children died as a result of this war, and millions more would have their lives forever changed. At the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, the victorious Allied powers met to discuss the new post-war world. In the U.S., the Truman Doctrine was implemented, which stood as a call to all nations under the threat of Soviet communism to show that the U.S. would intervene to ensure communist influence wouldn't be expanded. They also implemented the Marshall Plan, which sought to rebuild Europe through providing them with American aid and capital. In the West, the alliance known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed to create a defensive pact for American allied nations. While in the East, the Warsaw Pact was formed, which did the same as NATO, just this time for Soviet allied nations. The UN was also formed, a reformed League of Nations meant to stand for peace and preserve it whenever possible, a meeting place to resolve differences and diffuse conflicts, a place where all nations can be a part of the world community, a place looking for a better tomorrow. Thank you for listening to me ramble. I hope you enjoyed, and I'd like to thank Diego Villaseñor for helping me out with some of the editing in such a short time span, and the Kraka Devin Luna for reviewing some of my script before completion. Cheers.